The desert stretched beyond imagination, a vast ocean of sand and heat that seemed to erase distance itself. Nothing moved without permission from the sun. Every breath felt heavy, every sound swallowed instantly by the endless silence. It was in this place, where nature itself felt like an enemy, that a U.S. Special Operations unit advanced with controlled precision. Sergeant Elena Voss moved with them. She did not speak often. She did not need to. While others checked weapons and scanned horizons with nervous urgency, Elena's attention was elsewhere, on invisible threads only she seemed able to notice. Radio chatter, faint bursts of encrypted communication, and subtle irregularities in enemy signal patterns formed a hidden layer of the battlefield that most soldiers ignored. But not her. The team itself was hardened, trained for direct combat and rapid response. They were used to clear objectives, clean execution, and visible threats. Ghost warfare, the kind that moved through frequencies instead of gunfire, was not something they fully trusted, and Elena Voss represented exactly that kind of warfare. Their mission briefing had been simple, almost deceptively so. An enemy faction operating in the region had established a coordinated communication network, believed to be organizing a large-scale ambush against Allied forces in the near future. Intelligence suggested that if the network remained active for another 48 hours, multiple friendly units would be walking into a fully prepared kill zone. The objective: locate, infiltrate, and disrupt the system before it reached operational readiness. But intelligence in war was never clean. It arrived fragmented, delayed, and often wrong. As the team moved deeper into the desert, Elena began noticing inconsistencies. The enemy communications they intercepted were too structured for a loosely organized militant group. There was rhythm to it, predictable timing, layered encoding that suggested something far more advanced than expected. She slowed slightly, adjusting the small receiver attached to her vest. Static filled her earpiece, but beneath it patterns. Always patterns. Sergeant Voss, the team leader's voice broke through her focus, sharp and impatient. We're not here to chase signals, we're here to find targets. She looked up, meeting his gaze briefly. These signals are the target. A pause followed. Not disagreement exactly, more like dismissal. The kind given to specialists whose world felt too abstract for field reality. The leader turned away. Keep moving. They advanced. Hours passed under relentless sun. The desert did not change, but the tension inside the team grew heavier. Every dune looked the same, every shadow felt intentional. Somewhere beyond sight, enemy presence was increasing. The air itself seemed to tighten. Elena's readings grew more complex. She picked up layered transmissions, multiple channels operating simultaneously beneath a single command frequency. That was not normal insurgent behavior. That was structure, coordination, discipline. This isn't a small network, she finally said, breaking her usual silence. No one responded immediately. A soldier walking beside her exhaled sharply. Everything looks big when you stare at numbers long enough. It's not numbers, she replied quietly. It's architecture. That word lingered, but no one picked it up. By late afternoon, the temperature became unbearable. Heat shimmered across the horizon, bending light into distorted waves. The team stopped briefly behind a rocky formation to reassess direction. Water was rationed. Fatigue was beginning to slow reaction time. Even the most disciplined operators showed cracks in posture and patience. It was then that Elena noticed something new. A shift. The enemy communications changed cadence. Faster now, more alert, as if they knew something approaching. Her grip tightened slightly. We're being tracked, she said. The leader frowned. By what? She hesitated for the first time, not because she was unsure, but because she knew they would not like the answer. The network, she said, it's not just defensive, it's reactive. A short silence followed. Then the distant sound of movement, barely audible at first. Metallic, mechanical, patrol units. Too many. The team leader raised his hand. Form up, defensive spacing. The atmosphere shifted instantly from reconnaissance to survival. Weapons were checked. Positions adjusted. The desert, once empty, now felt crowded with unseen eyes. Alina scanned the horizon again. The pattern she had been tracking was accelerating. Something was triggering escalation protocols across the network. And then she understood. "They know we're here," she said. A soldier snapped back, "That's kind of the point." But Alina shook her head slightly. "No, I mean specifically us, our formation, our position. They're not reacting to presence, they're reacting to identity." The team leader finally turned fully toward her. "Explain." But before she could respond, the first gunshot cracked in the distance. Not random. Measured. Followed by another. And another. The desert, which had been silent for hours, suddenly came alive with invisible pressure closing in from multiple directions. Alina's voice dropped. "We're inside their response grid." The realization hit like a physical weight. This was not an encounter that was developing. It was one that had already been calculated long before they arrived. The leader raised his rifle. "All units move." And just like that, the desert stopped being empty. It became a trap. The desert wind had begun to rise, carrying fine grains of sand that scraped against goggles and skin like invisible shards. Visibility dropped in uneven waves, the horizon flickering between clarity and distortion. Every step felt like walking deeper into a place that did not want them there. The unit regrouped behind a jagged ridge of stone, using it as temporary cover. Breathing was heavier now, not just from exhaustion but from tension that had finally turned sharp enough to cut through discipline. The sound of distant gunfire had faded, but nobody believed it was gone. In environments like this, silence was never peace, it was preparation. Sergeant Alina Voss crouched slightly apart from the others, her receiver still active. She was no longer just listening. She was mapping. The enemy's communication network had expanded in real time, reacting faster than any irregular militia should have been capable of. Every adjustment she observed pointed toward something centralized, structured, and deeply intelligent. But the others were focused on survival in the most immediate sense. The team leader, Captain Rourke, checked his compass again even though GPS had already been unreliable for hours. "We're pushing east after this," he said firmly. "Extraction point is still viable if we move fast." A soldier shook his head. "Fast, we just got lit up from 3 sides." "Then we move smarter," Rourke snapped back. Alina looked up slightly. "Moving without understanding the system won't matter." That sentence landed heavier than intended. One of the soldiers, a bulky operator named Harlan, gave a short laugh. "System, it's a bunch of desert rats with radios." Alina didn't respond immediately. She adjusted a dial, narrowing the frequency range. The signals became clearer for a brief moment, just enough for her to confirm what she already suspected. "It's not rats," she said quietly. "It's coordination." Rourke turned toward her fully now. "Sergeant Voss, we're not here to debate philosophy. We've got enemy movement closing in and a window to exit this region." "I'm not debating," she replied. "I'm warning you." Another pause, the kind that grows uncomfortable because no one wants to be the first to accept it. Harlan stepped closer. "You've been staring at that box since we got here. What exactly are you seeing that none of us are?" Alina finally looked at him. "Patterns you're not trained to recognize." A brief silence followed, then a scoff from another soldier. "That's convenient." The frustration in the group was building now, not from fear alone, but from the inability to agree on what the threat actually was. Combat units depended on shared reality. When that fractured, everything became unstable. Rourke raised a hand. "Enough. We stick to mission parameters. Enemy contact is expected in hostile territory. That doesn't mean we overthink it. Alina stood slightly. It does when the contact is synchronized. That word again, synchronized. She could feel it now more clearly than before. The enemy network wasn't just reacting. It was learning, adjusting. Each transmission she intercepted carried subtle changes in timing, like a system refining itself based on input. And then something shifted. A burst of communication spiked across multiple frequencies at once. Not random chatter, command-level activation. The tone changed from surveillance to engagement readiness. Alina's expression tightened. They're accelerating deployment. Rourke exhaled sharply. Define accelerating. Units are converging, she said. Not scattered patrols, coordinated cells. They're collapsing distance between each other. Harlan shook his head again. You're saying they're organizing in real time, in this terrain? Yes. And you know this how? He pressed. She held up her receiver slightly. Because I can hear it. That was the problem, they couldn't. To them, the desert was still just desert. Open, harsh, dangerous in predictable ways. To Alina, it had become something else entirely, a layered battlefield where movement was dictated by unseen instruction. Rourke studied her for a moment longer than before. There was doubt there, but also fatigue. Command decisions were harder when certainty was eroding. Before he could respond, another burst of distant movement echoed across the dunes, this time closer, heavier. A soldier at the edge of the ridge raised his rifle instantly. Contact. But there was nothing visible yet, only sound, metal shifting, boots in sand, controlled spacing. Alina lowered herself slightly again, focusing harder. The network spike was no longer distant. It was surrounding them in fragments, small units closing from multiple vectors, each one receiving direction from the same source. We're inside their coordination perimeter, she said again, quieter now. They've already divided the area. Rourke turned sharply. That's not possible. We weren't on any mapped route. Alina's voice remained steady. Doesn't matter. The network mapped us. Another soldier muttered. That doesn't even make sense. But before anyone could continue, the first real engagement began. A single shot cracked across the ridge, striking stone and sending fragments into the air. Then another, and another. Not chaotic fire, measured, probing. Rourke reacted instantly. Down. The team dropped behind cover as sand erupted around them. The desert that had been still for hours suddenly became layered with controlled violence. Not a storm, but a structure unfolding. Alina didn't move as quickly as the others into pure defense. Her attention remained split, half in the physical world, half inside the signal map forming in her mind. The enemy wasn't just attacking them. They were positioning them. Flanking left, Harlan shouted. But Alina's voice cut through sharper. No, don't move left. He stared at her. Are you serious right now? Left is already occupied, she said. Another burst of fire answered that claim instantly. Sand exploded exactly where Harlan had been about to shift. He froze. Rourke looked between them, realization starting to form but not yet fully accepted. How are they predicting us? Alina's answer came quietly. They're not predicting. They're responding faster than we can decide. A beat of silence followed, broken only by distant movement tightening in. For the first time, Rourke's tone shifted. Less command, more uncertainty. What do we do? Alina adjusted her receiver again, eyes narrowing. The network was still expanding, but there was a structure inside it, something she could exploit. But it required time. And trust. I can break their coordination, she said. Harlan gave a sharp laugh again, but it lacked confidence now. From a radio. Alina didn't look away from the horizon, from their own system. Rourke hesitated. Around them, pressure increased. Enemy units were no longer distant. They were settling into positions. He finally spoke. "How long?" Elena paused, not because she didn't know, but because she knew exactly what it would cost. "Minutes," she said. A soldier swore under his breath. Rourke looked at the team, then back at her. The decision forming in real time was not tactical anymore. It was survival based on belief. "Do it," he said finally. And in that moment, everything shifted again, because trust in war was never given easily and never without consequence. The desert erupted into controlled chaos. Orders were shouted over the crack of distant rifle fire, boots scraping against rock as the team broke from their defensive ridge. The enemy wasn't fully visible yet, but their presence was everywhere. Measured bursts of gunfire, shifting silhouettes beyond the dunes, movement that felt too coordinated to be random. Captain Rourke raised his hand sharply. "Move, two-man spacing now." The unit reacted instantly, trained discipline overriding panic. They shifted positions, attempting to fall back toward a safer line of retreat. Sand whipped around them as the wind picked up again, turning the battlefield into a blur of heat and distortion. Sergeant Elena Voss stayed slightly behind the others. Not out of hesitation, but focus. Her receiver was now fully engaged, scanning overlapping frequencies. The enemy network had tightened its perimeter in response to their movement. Every time the team shifted position, the system adjusted within seconds. It wasn't just tracking them, it was anticipating them. That realization sat heavy in her mind. But the immediate world demanded attention too. "Harlan, cover the ridge," Rourke shouted. Harlan moved, firing short bursts toward a distant shape that vanished as quickly as it appeared. Another soldier dragged equipment across the sand. Everything was motion, urgency, compression of time into survival. And then it happened. A sharp burst of static exploded through Elena's earpiece, louder than before. A command-level transmission spike, multiple channels converging at once. Her eyes narrowed. "They're shifting formation," she said quickly. "All units are converging southwest. That's where we are." Rourke didn't slow down. "We're already moving southeast." "That doesn't matter," Elena replied. "They're not tracking where we are, they're predicting where we'll be forced to go." Another explosion of sand kicked up nearby, as a round impacted too close for comfort. The team pushed harder. But the desert was no longer empty space. It had become structured pressure. Every direction they chose seemed to collapse into resistance. Every route forward felt pre-read by something watching beyond sight. Elena adjusted her grip on the receiver. The system was adapting faster now, too fast. Then came the critical moment. A burst of coordinated movement hit from multiple directions at once. Not a full assault, but a tightening net. Enemy units were closing in on intersecting angles, forcing the team toward a narrowing corridor between dunes. "Break right," Rourke ordered. The squad shifted immediately. But Elena froze for half a second. Her receiver spiked again. "No," she said sharply. But it was already too late. The team had committed. They moved. And that single decision changed everything. As the group surged forward through the gap between dunes, a sudden wave of fire erupted from both sides, not chaotic, not scattered. Controlled, perfectly timed. Suppression fire designed not to kill immediately, but to guide movement. To direct them. To isolate. Elena dropped behind a rock formation, heart steady but calculation accelerating. She looked up just in time to see the formation split the team. Sand and smoke separated vision. Communication broke into fragments of shouting voices and static interference. "Fall back," someone yelled. "Left flank is exposed." Rourke were losing spacing. And then, silence on one channel. Elena checked her receiver instantly. One of the team nodes had disappeared from active communication grid. Not dead necessarily, but cut off. Her eyes sharpened. This wasn't random fragmentation. It was isolation strategy. The enemy wasn't just attacking them. They were dividing them. A sharp burst of movement forced her to shift position again. She rolled behind a low ridge as sand sprayed overhead. When she looked up again, the battlefield had changed shape. The team was no longer one unit. They were separated into pockets. And she was no longer with them. For a brief second, Alina stood still. Not fear. Assessment. Rourke's voice crackled through partial comms. Regroup on my mark. Repeat, regroup. But the signal broke mid-sentence. Then nothing. She tapped her receiver. The interference wasn't natural. It was targeted jamming, but selective. The enemy wasn't blocking all communication. They were allowing fragmentation. That meant they knew exactly who to isolate. A sudden realization settled in. Alina wasn't just separated accidentally. She was left behind deliberately. Whether by enemy maneuvering or battlefield chaos, it no longer mattered. The outcome was the same. The main unit was gone from her immediate proximity, swallowed by shifting dunes and signal interference. She slowly lowered herself behind cover. For the first time since the mission began, she was alone. The desert felt different now. Not louder. Not quieter. Focused. She checked her gear methodically. Rifle intact, receiver active, battery stable, minimal damage. The essentials of survival remained intact. But her team was gone. Far off, faint gunfire echoed, distant, scattered, increasingly disorganized. They were still fighting, but not as one unit anymore. Alina exhaled slowly, scanning the horizon. The enemy network was still active, still adjusting, still watching. She could feel it now more clearly than before, like pressure behind every grain of sand. Then her receiver spiked again. A new transmission layer opened. This time not tactical chatter. Command structure. Deep, layered, encrypted coordination. She tilted her head slightly. So this was it. The real system. Her isolation wasn't failure. It was access. She looked out across the dunes, where heat waves blurred the line between ground and sky. They didn't forget me, she murmured quietly. A pause. Then a faint, controlled breath. They removed me. Alina slowly adjusted her position, moving higher onto a ridge where signal reception was stronger. Her posture changed, not defensive anymore, but deliberate. The desert around her was no longer just battlefield terrain. It was now a network interface. And somewhere beyond the horizon, an entire coordinated enemy system had just unknowingly exposed itself to the one person they should have never isolated. The wind over the dunes had changed. It no longer howled like before. It whispered in uneven bursts, as if the desert itself was carrying fragments of distant communication. From her elevated position on the ridge, Sergeant Alina Voss could feel the battlefield in a way the others could not. Not through sight or sound alone, but through structure, patterns hidden beneath chaos. She settled behind a slab of sun-bleached stone, its surface hot enough to burn through fabric. Her breathing was controlled, measured. Around her, the world remained vast and empty, but her mind was now somewhere else entirely, inside the invisible architecture of war. The receiver in her hand pulsed softly. Not random static. Not noise. A network. She adjusted the frequency dial slightly, narrowing the bandwidth. Immediately, layers of encrypted communication resolved into something more defined. It was like peeling back sand to reveal steel beneath. Command nodes. Relay chains. Redundant backup channels. The enemy system was larger than she had initially calculated. Far larger. What she had first assumed to be a regional coordination network was, in reality, a distributed intelligence grid, self-adjusting, reactive, and deeply layered. Alina's eyes narrowed slightly. "This isn't insurgent grade," she muttered to herself. The system responded to her team's movements in real time. That meant it wasn't just pre-programmed. It was adaptive. Learning. A faint crackle came through the receiver, 3 overlapping transmissions converging into one encrypted directive. She replayed it internally, analyzing cadence, rhythm, compression timing. Then she understood something that made her pause for half a second. It wasn't just a communication network. It was a command intelligence loop. Every unit fed information upward. Every command adjusted downward. The system was constantly rewriting itself based on battlefield feedback. Which meant it had already registered her presence. A slight tension tightened in her jaw. She exhaled slowly, shifting her position deeper into the shadow of the rock. The sun had begun to lower, stretching the desert into long, distorted shapes. Light bent across the dunes like liquid gold fatting into rust. Far below, faint movement flickered. Enemy patrols. Not random. Aligned. They were no longer searching. They were converging. Alina raised the receiver again, this time switching to passive capture mode. She stopped injecting any signal of her own and simply listened. The system revealed itself more clearly when it wasn't being touched. Dozens of channels. Hundreds of micro-transmissions. Each one carrying fragments of intent rather than full commands. She closed her eyes briefly, mapping it mentally. Left cluster, perimeter sweep. Central grid, containment. Right flank, pressure advancement. And beneath all of it, something deeper. A coordination core. That was the target. Not soldiers. Not patrols. The brain. Her fingers tightened slightly around the device. But then another realization settled in. She was no longer just observing it. She was inside it. The moment she was separated from her team, her equipment had been partially synchronized with enemy frequencies, likely due to proximity interference during the collapse of formation. A side effect of electronic warfare in dense signal environments. Or a flaw. Or an opportunity. Alina slowly reached into her pack and retrieved a compact module, custom-built, stripped of any identifying markers. It was not standard issue. It never had been. She attached it carefully to the receiver. The moment she powered it on, the device hummed faintly, recalibrating itself. A silent handshake. Then access widened. The network didn't resist. It accepted. Her expression changed slightly. Not surprise. Recognition. "They're open loop," she whispered. "They're not locking external intrusion fast enough." That meant one thing. The system had never been breached from the inside before. She leaned back slightly, eyes scanning the horizon again. The battlefield was quiet in a way that felt unnatural. Even distant gunfire had faded into irregular bursts. Her team was somewhere out there, fragmented, still trying to regroup. But they were no longer the center of this conflict. She was. Alina began mapping signal routes faster now. Her fingers moved with quiet precision, isolating relay nodes, tracing dependencies between clusters. Each layer she uncovered revealed another beneath it. It was like dismantling a machine while it was still running. And the machine didn't yet realize it was being touched. A faint smile, barely noticeable, crossed her face. Not joy. Focus. Then she paused. A transmission spike. Larger than before. The entire network shifted its tone. She froze for a fraction of a second, listening. The system had registered anomaly detection. It was beginning to react. Slowly at first, then faster. Elena opened her eyes fully. "Too late," she whispered. She adjusted the module again, rerouting herself deeper into the signal flow. Now she wasn't just listening to the system. She was inside its response layer. Below her, movement increased in the distance. Enemy units were shifting positions more aggressively now. The pattern had changed from passive tracking to active correction. They had noticed distortion, but they did not yet know the source. Elena stood slowly, stepping closer to the edge of the ridge. From here she could see fragments of the battlefield, dust trails, faint silhouettes, heat distortion masking movement. She was alone, but not disconnected. The system around her was alive, and she was now part of it. Her voice came low, steady. "Let's see how you react when the silence stops being yours." She lowered the receiver slightly, fingers poised. And for the first time since the mission began, she stopped being a target and became the interference. The desert no longer felt like open terrain. It felt like a sealed system. Every grain of sand seemed to sit under observation. Every shift of wind carried invisible weight, as if the battlefield itself had developed awareness. Sergeant Elena Voss stood at the edge of the ridge, her receiver now fully integrated into the enemy's communication flow. What had once been interception had quietly become insertion. She was inside their network, not as a guest, as a variable. Below her, movement increased in controlled waves. Enemy units were no longer simply patrolling, they were correcting, adjusting, responding to something they could not yet identify. The pattern had changed subtly but unmistakably. Tighter spacing, faster relay cycles, reduced latency between commands. They knew something was wrong. They just didn't know what. Elena exhaled slowly, lowering herself behind the rock again. Her fingers moved across the interface module attached to her receiver. It was feeding her live structural maps of the communication grid now, nodes branching like veins through invisible terrain. 3 major clusters, dozens of relay points, one central coordination core, buried deep within encrypted layers. That was the heart. If it fell silent, everything else would collapse. A faint transmission spike passed through the system. She caught it instantly. A command verification request. The network was testing itself, checking for corruption. Elena didn't move immediately. Instead, she watched how the system responded to its own uncertainty. That was the key. Most people assumed systems broke from external force, but intelligent systems often revealed themselves when they began to doubt their own integrity. And this one was starting to doubt. She initiated the first change carefully. Not an attack, a delay. She inserted a microscopic timing offset into a relay channel between 2 mid-level nodes, barely perceptible, a fraction of a second shift in synchronization. On paper, it meant nothing. In practice, it meant hesitation. Below, 2 enemy units received overlapping instructions a moment out of sync. The result was immediate but subtle. A patrol that should have turned left hesitated, recalculated, then turned right instead. That right turn placed them directly into another unit's path. Elena watched without expression. Collision. Confusion. Radio chatter spiked briefly across the channel. Confirm movement order. Repeat last directive. Did you adjust route? The system attempted correction almost instantly. New commands were issued, rerouting both units, but now there was noise in the logic. A contradiction had entered the flow. Elena whispered softly to herself, "That's the first break." She expanded the interference slightly. Another timing shift. Another relay delay. 2 more nodes became desynchronized. This time, the effect was larger. A patrol group halted completely, waiting for confirmation that never aligned properly. Their communication loop began cycling, repeating instructions in overlapping fragments. Farther out, another unit interpreted the delay as loss of command authority and switched to fallback protocol. Independent mode. The network was no longer fully unified. It was fragmenting. Alina's focus sharpened. "This is why you build redundancy," she murmured, "so you don't notice when it starts failing." A faint crackle came through her receiver again, stronger this time. The system had escalated its verification layer. Encryption keys were rotating faster. Authentication cycles were tightening. It was reacting. Good. That meant it felt her. She leaned slightly forward. Now came the dangerous part. A more aggressive correction from the system would attempt to isolate the anomaly. If it succeeded, her access would be cut. If it failed, the system would begin internal segmentation. Either way, the battlefield would change. Alina initiated a second phase. She injected a false command signature, carefully reconstructed from fragments she had observed earlier. It wasn't perfect. It didn't need to be. It only needed to be convincing enough to pass through one layer of validation. A relay node accepted it. Then another. For a brief moment, the system believed the signal was internal. Alina's eyes narrowed slightly. There it is. She expanded the false directive across a limited cluster, just enough to redirect two mid-tier command flows. Immediately, enemy units responded. But incorrectly. A patrol group began advancing instead of holding position. Another disengaged prematurely from a surveillance perimeter. A third redirected entirely toward a previously cleared zone. The battlefield, once precise, began to misalign. From her vantage point, Alina could see it unfolding like a slow fracture. Not explosive, not dramatic, just wrong in small, accumulating ways. Then came the reaction. A sharp system-wide recalibration pulse. The network attempted to reset synchronization. For a moment, everything stabilized. Alina paused, then smiled faintly. "That's your reflex," she whispered, "not your solution." She waited exactly 3 seconds, then disrupted the reset cycle. Not aggressively, precisely. She introduced a micro-delay into the recalibration handshake itself. And that was the real crack. Because now the system was attempting to fix itself using a broken timing reference. Below, chaos didn't explode, it seeped in. Command chains began diverging. Units that should have been unified began splitting decisions mid-execution. Orders were partially received, partially overwritten, partially ignored. A patrol halted in open desert, unsure whether to advance or retreat. Another engaged a target that no longer existed in its updated feed. The network was still functional, but no longer consistent. Alina listened as the frequency spectrum filled with confusion. Repeat directive. Signal unclear. Confirm command source. Her hands remained steady. "This is how you fall apart," she said quietly. "Not all at once, just slightly wrong in too many places." A new transmission spike emerged. Stronger. Heavier. Central core response initiating. The system had now identified the disturbance as internal compromise. Containment protocols began activating. Alina straightened slightly. Now it would fight back properly. And when it did, everything would escalate. Far below, movement intensified again, but this time it wasn't controlled, it was reactive. The desert, once a coordinated battlefield, was beginning to lose its shape. The first crack had formed, and Alina Voss stood exactly where it began to spread. The desert had changed its behavior. What was once structured chaos was now collapsing into something far less predictable: fragmented movement, broken commands, and hesitation spreading through enemy lines like an unseen infection. From her position on the ridge, Sergeant Alina Voss could feel the system fighting itself. Not her. It was fighting her interference. The network had stopped behaving like a single mind. It was now a collection of conflicting instincts trying to reassemble coherence under pressure. Every correction it made only exposed another weakness in timing, another fracture in synchronization. Alina watched quietly as the battlefield below shifted again. A patrol unit stopped mid-movement, then turned, then stopped again. No clear directive was reaching them intact anymore. Her receiver pulsed steadily, feeding her real-time degradation data across multiple channels. The interference she had introduced earlier was no longer subtle. It had spread beyond the initial cluster. Relay nodes were failing to agree with each other, creating overlapping command loops that contradicted themselves. The system was still alive, but it was no longer unified. Alina adjusted a dial on her module. "This is where it decides," she whispered. A faint burst of static answered her. Then everything escalated. The Central Coordination Corps initiated a full-spectrum diagnostic sweep. Across the desert, enemy communication channels surged simultaneously as authentication protocols were forcibly reset. It was a violent internal correction attempt, like a body trying to purge a virus it couldn't fully locate. For a moment, everything tightened. Then it broke. Alina felt it before she fully saw it. The network collapsed its own synchronization layer. Not intentionally, but as a consequence of overcorrection. Across every frequency she was monitoring, signals began to fail in rapid succession. Relay nodes dropped out one by one, not due to destruction, but due to loss of coherence. Commands stopped matching their responses. Verification chains failed. Encryption loops could no longer confirm their own origins. And then, silence. Not battlefield silence. System silence. Alina froze for half a second, listening carefully. Nothing. No structured communication. No layered transmission grid. Just fragments of static trying and failing to reconstruct meaning. She exhaled slowly. "Blackout," she said quietly. Below her, the enemy force reacted immediately, but without coordination. Units attempted to switch to backup frequencies. Others defaulted to manual protocols. Some simply stopped moving altogether, awaiting instruction that would never arrive in time. The desert, once controlled by invisible structure, was now blind. Far off she could hear distant gunfire again, but it was different now, disorganized, uneven, reactive rather than planned, like a machine that had lost its instructions but not its motion. Alina lowered her receiver slightly. Her interference had done more than disrupt communication. It had removed direction. A system could survive noise. It could even survive damage. But it could not function without alignment. She checked her module again. The readouts confirmed what she was already observing: total collapse of synchronized command layers across the region. Secondary networks were attempting to compensate, but without the central core they were operating blindly. Then her receiver crackled again. A new signal. Stronger than before. Not fragmented. Not unstable. Controlled. Alina's eyes narrowed. "They recovered partial routing," she murmured. The system wasn't dead. It was adapting. Some nodes had isolated themselves from the collapse and were now attempting to rebuild structure independently. Smaller command clusters were forming localized control zones. But they were slower. Much slower. And that delay mattered. Because now, they were exposed. A faint movement caught her attention across the dunes. Not random patrol behavior anymore. This was repositioning. Units were trying to re-establish visual contact with each other instead of relying on comms. The battlefield had reverted to something older. Something primitive. Line of sight. Elena observed carefully. "This is what you become without a network," she said softly. "Just movement and uncertainty." A distant explosion echoed across the desert. Not coordinated. Isolated. Another followed seconds later. Then another. The system was breaking into independent pockets of violence, each unaware of the other's position. Friendly fire risk increased instantly. Units that should have been aligned were now misidentifying each other. Elena adjusted her position slightly, staying within the shadow of the ridge. Her role had shifted again without announcement. She was no longer just an infiltrator inside a system. She was now the reason the system had no center. Her receiver suddenly lit up with a burst of attempted resynchronization. The enemy core was trying to rebuild a master channel. But it was too late. The timing reference it relied on no longer matched reality. Elena tilted her head slightly. "You're rebuilding on broken time," she whispered. And then she acted again. Not with force. With precision. She inserted a final distortion into the master synchronization pulse. Just enough. Not to destroy it, but to misalign it permanently. Across the battlefield, every remaining coordinated attempt to reconnect failed simultaneously. It was subtle at first, then absolute. One by one, channels went dead, then returned as static, then failed again, until finally, nothing held together. The desert fell into complete communication blackout. Elena closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the absence settle in. No structured transmissions. No layered commands. No system presence. Just scattered movement below. The enemy was still there. But it was no longer a network. It was individuals in a desert that no longer spoke to itself. She opened her eyes again slowly. "This is the part they never see coming," she said quietly. Far behind her, faint movements suggested her own team might still be active somewhere within the fragmented battlefield. But for now, they were irrelevant to the structure of the conflict. Because the structure no longer existed. Elena stood up fully for the first time since the collapse began. The desert was silent again. But it was a different kind of silence now. Not emptiness. Absence of control. And somewhere deep inside the broken system, something was still trying to understand what had just happened. Too slowly. Much too slowly, the desert no longer felt like a battlefield. It felt like aftermath that hadn't finished happening yet. Scattered echoes of gunfire still drifted across the dunes, but they no longer followed rhythm or coordination. They were isolated bursts, confused reactions from units that could no longer confirm where friend ended and enemy began. The silence Elena had created wasn't peace. It was disorientation stretched across miles of sand. Sergeant Elena Voss stood on the ridge, watching the collapse unfold in real time. The enemy force had fractured completely. Without a unified communication structure, their advantage had dissolved into something primitive: visual contact, guesswork, and reaction. Units that once moved as part of a synchronized grid were now operating independently, often crossing paths without awareness of each other. She lowered her receiver slightly. The system was still trying to recover. That was the dangerous part. A broken machine that still thinks it can function will always attempt repairs, no matter how unstable the foundation. Behind her, faint radio noise flickered intermittently. Not enemy channels anymore, but fragments of Allied communication trying to stabilize across the disrupted spectrum. Then, a voice broke through. "Work to any unit. Respond if you can hear me." It was weak, distorted, but real. Elena paused. Her team, they were still alive. Somewhere in the fragmented desert, Captain Rourke was attempting to regroup what remained of their formation. But without structure, every movement carried uncertainty. She adjusted her receiver quickly, narrowing the filter range. The battlefield map reconstructed itself in partial layers, flickering positions, unstable contact points, and rapidly changing vectors. Her team wasn't far. But they weren't together either. "Sergeant Voss," Rourke's voice came again, more strained this time. "If you're receiving, report status." Elena exhaled slowly. For the first time since isolation, she wasn't acting inside the enemy system anymore. She was re-entering her own. "Receiving," she responded calmly. A pause. Then a faint surge of relief through the channel. "Where are you?" Rourke asked. Elena scanned the dunes. Enemy movement had slowed but not stopped. Without coordination, they were still dangerous, but unpredictably so. "High ridge north of last engagement zone," she said. Another pause. Then static. The communication was unstable, not because of enemy interference now, but because the system itself was still collapsing in residual loops. Frequencies were unstable across the entire region. Rourke's voice returned, sharper. "We're regrouping at reference point Echo 3. Can you move?" Elena watched movement below. Several enemy units were now converging blindly on overlapping paths, unaware they were crossing the same terrain from different directions. The lack of coordination had turned the battlefield into overlapping chaos patterns. "Yes," she said finally, "but it's not clear anymore." "Explain," Rourke ordered. Elena hesitated briefly, then replied. "Their system is gone. They're not operating as a network anymore. They're reacting individually." A pause followed. Then Harlan's voice cut in, slightly distorted. "So they're blind." "Not blind," Elena corrected. "Disconnected." Silence. That distinction mattered. Blindness implied weakness. Disconnection meant unpredictability. And unpredictability in combat was often more dangerous than coordination. Rourke's tone shifted. "We move carefully then, stay tight, no unnecessary contact." Elena began descending from the ridge, moving along the edge of broken terrain where visibility was uneven. The sun had begun to lower further, stretching shadows across the sand in long, fractured lines. As she moved, she kept monitoring both systems, the remnants of enemy chatter and the fragile restoration of Allied comms. Then something changed. A new pattern emerged. Not from the enemy network, but from its remnants. A secondary coordination attempt. Smaller clusters of enemy units were beginning to self-organize, not through centralized command but through proximity-based communication, visual signals, line-of-sight coordination, instinctive regrouping. It wasn't as efficient as before, but it was functional. Elena slowed slightly. "They're adapting," she said quietly. Rourke responded immediately. "Define adapting." "They've lost central command," she explained, "but they're forming local control groups." A pause. "That makes them more dangerous?" Harlan asked. Elena stepped over a ridge line, scanning movement in the distance. "Yes," she said, "because they're no longer predictable." At that exact moment, a distant burst of gunfire erupted, not coordinated but sudden and sharp. Two enemy clusters had encountered each other without recognition. The engagement was immediate and chaotic. No signals. No verification. Just reaction. Elena watched carefully. "This is the turning point," she murmured. Rourke heard her. "What do you mean?" She stopped for a moment. "Before they moved as one system," she said. "Now they move as fragments." Another explosion echoed in the distance. "And fragments don't negotiate, they collide." Rourke absorbed that in silence. Then came his response. "Can we still extract under these conditions?" Alina checked her surroundings again. Her team's position was stabilizing, but movement paths were unpredictable. Enemy clusters were now spread unevenly across the terrain, some regrouping, others still in confusion. "Yes," she said finally, "but the corridor is no longer controlled." A brief pause. Then Rourke gave the order. "Move anyway." Alina adjusted her grip and continued forward. Above her, the desert sky was shifting into dusk. The heat had not lessened, but the light had softened into something unstable. Shadows stretched across the dunes like broken lines trying to reconnect. As she moved toward the regroup point, she realized something quietly unsettling. The battle had not ended when the network collapsed. It had changed form. Now it was no longer about control. It was about survival inside uncertainty. And somewhere beyond the visible horizon, the enemy was still trying to rebuild structure from fragments, just as her own team was trying to rebuild itself from separation. Two broken systems moving through the same desert. Neither fully blind, neither fully coordinated, and both unaware of how close they still were to collision. The desert had begun to cool, but it did not feel calmer. Heat still clung to the sand like a memory that refused to fade, and every shadow stretched longer as dusk settled over the dunes. What had once been a structured battlefield was now a fractured landscape of movement. Isolated groups, uncertain patrols, and fatting bursts of gunfire that no longer followed any recognizable chain of command. Sergeant Alina Voss moved steadily through it. Not rushed, not hesitant, measured. Her receiver remained active, but the signals it once relied on were now degraded into unstable fragments. What had been a full intelligence map only hours earlier was now a partial echo of itself, useful, but no longer absolute. That was the nature of collapse. It never stayed clean. Behind her, faintly across the cracked frequency channel, Captain Rourke's voice returned again. "Echo 3 is compromised. Repeat, Echo 3 is compromised. Adjust route to secondary extraction corridor." Static interrupted the transmission halfway through the sentence, then resolved again with difficulty. Alina paused briefly, scanning the terrain ahead. The extraction corridor was no longer a defined path. It was a suggestion shaped by probability rather than certainty. "Copy," she responded. Her voice remained calm, but her attention was split across multiple layers of awareness. Enemy clusters still existed in pockets across the desert, some regrouping, some engaging each other in confusion, others simply moving without direction. But the most important shift had already happened. The system was gone. Not destroyed. Dismantled. And in its absence, something far more unstable had taken its place. Alina continued forward, cresting a low dune where visibility briefly opened. From here, she could see movement in multiple directions, some coordinated, some erratic, none fully aligned. The battlefield had become a scattering of independent decisions colliding in real time. Then her receiver crackled sharply. A new signal. Stronger, more stable. It wasn't enemy. It was her team. "Voss, visual confirmation required." Rourke's voice came through, clearer now. "We are 2 clicks from extraction point." Alina adjusted her position slightly, scanning the horizon. "Receiving. I see movement east of your position," she said. A pause. Then Harlan's voice tense. "Is it hostile?" Alina focused. A group of figures moved across the dunes in a loose formation. No clear spacing, no visible coordination patterns, just motion. "Yes," she said quietly, "but they don't know what they're looking at either." That was the reality now. Identification had replaced coordination. Reaction had replaced strategy. Rourke responded immediately. "Avoid contact. We don't have time for engagement." Alina moved to intercept their route, guiding her approach through terrain that offered partial cover. As she advanced, she realized something subtle but important. The enemy presence was thinning. Not because they were retreating, but because they were scattered. Without communication, they were no longer reinforcing each other. Every engagement reduced their numbers locally without broader consequence. The system that once made them dangerous had turned into fragmentation that consumed itself. She reached a ridge overlooking the extraction zone. Two transport vehicles were visible below, partially concealed behind terrain. Their engines were running low, engines idling in irregular cycles. Around them, Allied soldiers formed a loose perimeter, tense, alert, but no longer under structured pressure. Rourke was there. He looked up the moment she appeared. For a second, neither of them spoke. Then he raised his hand slightly. "Get down here," he said. Alina descended carefully, boots pressing into unstable sand as she approached the group. The soldiers around her watched her differently now, not with dismissal, not with confusion, but with something closer to recalibrated understanding. She had not been left behind. She had remained where the system broke. Harlan was the first to speak as she arrived. "So that was you." Alina didn't answer immediately. She checked the horizon first. Distant movement still flickered in fragmented patterns. Some enemy units were still active, still searching, still reacting. "Yes," she said finally. Rourke stepped closer. "We're confirming reports from command. Entire enemy coordination structure collapsed. Signals went dark across the grid." Alina nodded slightly. "It wasn't collapse," she corrected. "It was disconnection." That distinction mattered, because collapse implied an end. Disconnection implied something still trying to reconnect. Rourke studied her for a moment, then spoke more quietly. "We lost contact with you during the split. We assumed you were." He didn't finish the sentence. Alina understood anyway. "Left behind," she said. A brief silence followed. Not uncomfortable, just real. Then Rourke shook his head slightly. "You weren't left behind. You were separated in chaos." Alina didn't respond to that correction. It didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that the battlefield had changed shape because of what happened in that separation. A distant echo of gunfire rolled across the dunes again, fainter now, less frequent. Rourke gestured toward the vehicles. "We move in 3 minutes, no delays." The team began loading equipment. Alina stayed for a moment longer, looking back across the desert. Somewhere out there, fragments of the enemy system were still trying to rebuild themselves. Not successfully, not coherently, but persistently. That was what systems did. They resisted silence. She finally turned back toward extraction. As she stepped into the vehicle, Rourke looked at her again. "Next time," he said quietly, "I want you on comms before you rewrite an entire battlefield." Alina allowed a faint pause, then replied just as quietly, "There won't be a next time like this." The doors closed. Engines engaged. And as the convoy moved away from the desert, the last view of the battlefield showed something unsettled still lingering in the fading light. Not victory, not defeat, but a system that had learned what it meant to lose its voice.